What happens when a single melody can unlock decades of buried family secrets? For Emma Harper, a 29-year-old waitress struggling to pay for her mother's assisted living care, that melody would emerge from the most unexpected source on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. For Alexander Thornfield, a man whose pharmaceutical empire had made him one of Boston's most powerful figures, it would be the first note in a symphony of revelations that would shatter everything he believed about his legacy. She was simply trying to make it through another double shift at the exclusive Harbor Club. He was just another wealthy member expecting impeccable service. But when she heard the haunting melody emanating from the antique music box on his table, a memory buried deep in childhood would surface with crystalline clarity. This isn't just a story about hidden wealth or forgotten inheritance. This is the story of how a delicate silver music box, crafted in Vienna over 80 years ago, would expose a conspiracy of silence that had torn two families apart for generations, proving that some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how deeply they're hidden. The mahogany-paneled dining room of the Harbor Club overlooked Boston's historic waterfront, its tall windows framing sailboats that bobbed like white birds against the steel-gray October sky. Emma Harper moved between the leather-upholstered chairs with practiced efficiency, her black uniform pressed to perfection despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. The exclusive Gentlemen's Club had been serving Boston's elite since 1847, and the weight of that history seemed to permeate every polished surface and oil painting of long-dead industrialists. At precisely 2:30 p.m., as the lunch crowd began to thin, Emma noticed a distinguished gentleman at corner table 7, carefully placing a small object beside his coffee cup. Alexander Thornfield was a familiar sight at the club. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the bearing of a man who had inherited not just wealth, but the absolute certainty that he belonged in rooms like this. His family's pharmaceutical company, Thornfield Industries, had dominated New England's medical landscape for over 6 decades. Emma approached with her professional smile, notepad ready. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thornfield. Will you be having your usual today, or would you prefer to see our seasonal menu?" Alexander looked up from examining what appeared to be an antique music box, his sharp blue eyes holding the brief assessing glance she had come to expect from the club's members. "Just coffee, Emma, the Brazilian blend, if you would. And perhaps you could tell me, does this piece look familiar to you?" The question caught her off guard. Members rarely engaged in personal conversation with the staff. She glanced at the music box and felt her breath catch in her throat. It was exquisite, made of sterling silver with intricate engravings of dancing figures around its base. The lid was slightly open, revealing a tiny ballerina figure poised in eternal pirouette. But it wasn't the craftsmanship that stopped her cold. It was the melody. Alexander's finger had touched a small lever, and the delicate notes began to flow. A haunting waltz that seemed to carry with it the weight of forgotten dreams and lost time. The melody wrapped around Emma like a memory made tangible, transporting her instantly to her grandmother's tiny apartment in South Boston, where an identical music box had sat on the dresser beside faded photographs and rosary beads. Yes, actually," Emma said, her voice barely steady. "My grandmother had one exactly like it. She said it was made in Vienna before the war. She used to play it every evening while she brushed her hair." Alexander's coffee cup froze, halfway to his lips, his composed expression cracking like ice under sudden pressure. "Your grandmother? What was her name?" "Isabella Santos. Isabella Marie Santos. She died when I was 15, but she treasured that music box more than anything else she owned. She said it was a gift from someone she loved, someone she could never forget." The color drained from Alexander's face, as if someone had opened a vein. His hands began to tremble, and Emma watched in alarm as he set down his cup with the careful precision of a man fighting to maintain control. "Santos," he repeated, the name emerging like a prayer or a curse. "Isabella Santos from South Boston?" "Yes, sir." Did you know her?" For a long moment, the dining room seemed to hold its breath. The gentle murmur of conversation from other tables faded into background noise as Alexander stared at Emma with an intensity that made her feel like she was being examined under a microscope. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Isabella Santos was my mother." The words hit Emma like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and making her grip the back of a nearby chair for support. "That's impossible," she stammered. "Your mother was Margaret Thornfield. The society pages are always mentioning her charitable foundations, her work with the symphony. Isabella was... she was poor. She cleaned houses and took in sewing to make ends meet. Margaret Thornfield was my father's second wife," Alexander said, his voice hollow with realization. "She married him when I was 5 years old and adopted me legally. I was told my birth mother died in childbirth, that she was just a young woman who had worked briefly as household help before her tragic death." Emma felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as the implications began to sink in. "If Isabella was your mother, then that means we're family," Alexander finished, the words carrying the weight of a revelation that threatened to upend both their worlds. "You're my half-sister's granddaughter, my great-niece." The music box continued its haunting melody, filling the silence between them with notes that seemed to mock the carefully constructed lies that had kept their families apart for decades. Emma's mind raced as childhood memories flooded back, her grandmother's stories about a baby she had given up, about a wealthy family that had taken her child and promised to give him opportunities she never could. Stories Emma had dismissed as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman whose mind sometimes wandered into fantasy. "She never stopped loving you," Emma whispered, tears threatening to spill over. She kept that music box on her dresser, and every night she would wind it up and listen to the melody. She said it reminded her of holding you as a baby, of singing you to sleep before they took you away. Alexander's composed businessman facade crumbled entirely. For a moment, he looked like nothing more than a lost child, trying to understand why his world had suddenly become unrecognizable. "They told me she was dead. For 64 years, I believed my mother was dead." Emma pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, scrolling to a photograph she had treasured since her grandmother's funeral. It showed Isabella in her final years, sitting in her favorite chair by the window, the music box open on the table beside her. Despite the obvious poverty of her surroundings, the worn furniture, the faded curtains, the linoleum floors that had seen better decades, there was a dignity in her bearing that spoke of inner strength and unshakable love. Alexander stared at the photograph as if it contained the answers to every question that had haunted him throughout his privileged but emotionally hollow childhood. "She looks like someone who would have sung lullabies," he said, his voice breaking. "I've always wondered why I could never remember my mother's voice, why there were no early memories, no sense of being loved before Margaret came into our lives." "There are more pictures," Emma said gently, "and letters. She wrote you a letter every year on your birthday, even though she knew she could never send them. She kept them all in a shoebox under her bed." The revelation seemed to physically stagger Alexander. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an elegant leather wallet, extracting a business card with the kind of reverent care usually reserved for handling priceless artifacts. "Emma Harper," he said, reading her full name from her name tag and writing it on the back of the card. "I need to know everything. Every story she told, every memory she shared, every detail about the family that was stolen from me." He placed the card on the table between them, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Can you meet me tomorrow? Somewhere private where we can talk without interruption. There are things I need to tell you about what really happened, about why they separated us, and why they've spent 6 decades covering up the truth." Emma looked down at the business card. Alexander Thornfield, Chairman and CEO, Thornfield Industries, embossed in gold lettering beneath the company's medical caduceus logo. The address was in the heart of Boston's financial district, in a building she had passed countless times but never imagined entering. "Why would they lie about something like that?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would be uglier than she wanted to hear. Alexander's expression hardened, revealing glimpses of the ruthless businessman who had built an empire from his father's modest pharmaceutical company. "Because Isabella wasn't just poor, Emma. She was unmarried. In 1959, that kind of scandal could destroy a family's reputation, especially a family trying to establish itself in Boston society. They paid her to disappear, to sign away her rights, and then they rewrote history to make sure no one would ever question their version of events." "But she never forgot you," Emma insisted. "She never stopped hoping that someday you'd find your way back to her. And now I have," Alexander said quietly. 64 years too late to tell her I never stopped missing something I couldn't even remember, but not too late to honor her memory and make sure the truth finally comes to light. As Emma left the Harbor Club that evening, the music box melody still echoing in her mind, she realized that her life had just taken a turn toward a destiny she had never imagined. Somewhere in the elegant townhouses of Beacon Hill, powerful people who had spent decades protecting their version of the truth were about to discover that some secrets refuse to stay buried, especially when they're carried in the heart of a grandmother's love. The next evening, Emma found herself in the climate-controlled basement of her mother's modest ranch house in Medford, surrounded by cardboard boxes that held the accumulated memories of 3 generations of Santos women. Her mother, Patricia Harper, sat nearby in her wheelchair, her multiple sclerosis having progressed significantly over the past year, but her mind still sharp and her memory intact when it came to family history. "You're looking for Grandma Isabella's letters again?" Patricia asked, her words slightly slurred but filled with curiosity. "You haven't been interested in those old stories since you were a little girl. Mom, I need you to tell me everything you remember about Isabella's baby," Emma said, her voice urgent with newfound purpose. "The son she gave up for adoption. Did she ever tell you his name? Did she ever mention the family that took him?" Patricia's expression grew troubled, her eyes taking on the distant look that always appeared when she delved into painful family history. "She called him Alessandro, her little prince. She said his father was from a wealthy family, but he died in a car accident before the baby was born. The family, they offered her money to sign papers, to let them raise the child as their own." "What family, Mom? Do you remember any names?" "Thornfield," Patricia said after a long pause. "She said they changed his name to Alexander Thornfield, that they told everyone he was adopted from an agency. She made me promise never to try to contact him, said it would only bring trouble to both families." Emma felt her heart racing as the pieces began to fall into place. "She kept letters?" "In the cedar chest in the back closet, behind the Christmas decorations, just like she taught me to hide important things. She said someday, when she was gone, someone might need to know the truth." Emma found the cedar chest exactly where her mother had indicated, wrapped in protective cloth and smelling faintly of lavender and mothballs. Inside were treasures that told the story of a woman who had loved deeply and lost everything: baptismal certificates, immigration papers from the Azores, and most heartbreaking of all, 64 letters addressed to "My dearest Alessandro." Each letter was dated on the same day, September 15th, and each one chronicled another year of a mother's love preserved in careful Portuguese script. The early letters were filled with details about his imagined childhood, hopes for his education, prayers for his happiness. As the years progressed, they became more reflective, filled with memories of the few precious weeks they had shared before the adoption papers were signed. But it was the final letter, written just months before Isabella's death, that made Emma's heart break completely. "My dearest Alessandro, today you turn 64, and I am dying. The doctors say I have weeks, perhaps days, but I'm not afraid because I know that love never truly dies. I kept the music box your father gave me, the one that played when you were growing inside me. I wound it every night and pretended you could hear it wherever you were. I know they told you I was dead, but a mother's love cannot be killed by lies or money or shame. Someday, someone will find these letters, and they will know that you were loved every single day of your life, even when we were apart, even when you didn't know I existed. Your loving mother, Isabella. Through her tears, Emma noticed something else in the cedar chest, a manila envelope marked legal documents in Isabella's careful handwriting. Inside were papers that made her blood run cold with their implications. Birth certificate for Alessandro Santos, born September 15th, 1959. Father listed as Edmund Thornfield, Jr. Adoption papers signed under obvious duress, with clauses that seemed designed more to silence Isabella than to protect the child's interests. And most damning of all, a copy of a contract offering Isabella $50,000, a fortune in 1959, in exchange for her permanent silence about the child's parentage. The papers revealed that Alexander's father hadn't died in an accident. He had been very much alive when the adoption took place, already married to another woman. The Thornfield family had orchestrated the entire cover-up to protect their reputation and their son's political ambitions. At exactly 3 p.m. the following day, Emma stood before the imposing granite facade of Thornfield Tower, a 50-story monument to pharmaceutical innovation that rose from Boston's financial district like a glass and steel cathedral. The lobby was a shrine to medical progress, with displays showcasing the company's breakthrough medications and philanthropic efforts in global health initiatives. Alexander's assistant, a polished woman in her 50s who radiated the kind of professional competence that came from managing the schedules of powerful men, escorted Emma to the executive elevator. The ride to the 45th floor felt like ascending through clouds, the city shrinking below them until Boston Harbor looked like a child's bathtub, and the historic neighborhoods became patterns of intersecting lines. Alexander's office was a study in understated elegance, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city and harbor, walls lined with medical journals and awards recognizing his contributions to pharmaceutical research. Behind his desk hung a portrait of a stern-faced man in early 20th century formal wear, the nameplate reading Edmund Thornfield Sr., founder. But it was the smaller portrait on Alexander's desk that caught Emma's attention, a formal family photograph from what appeared to be the 1960s, showing a young Alexander with an older man and an elegant woman, who was clearly not Isabella Santos. "That's Margaret," Alexander said, following her gaze. "The only mother I ever knew. She was kind to me, but there was always something distant about our relationship. Now I understand why." Emma spread Isabella's letters across his desk, like evidence in a trial, watching as Alexander read each one with growing emotion. When he reached the final letter, the one written just before Isabella's death, his composed businessman facade crumbled entirely. "She died believing I had forgotten her," he whispered. "She died thinking I had chosen wealth over the memory of her love." "She died knowing she had loved you completely," Emma corrected gently. "That's what mattered to her, not whether you remembered, but that the love itself was real and lasting." Alexander picked up the legal documents, his expression darkening as he studied the adoption papers and the contract for Isabella's silence. $50,000, he said, his voice bitter with realization. "They bought my mother's silence for the cost of a luxury car." "There's something else," Emma said, producing the birth certificate. "Your father didn't die in an accident. Edmund Thornfield Jr. was alive when you were born, already married to someone else. The whole story about him being tragically killed was fabricated to explain why he couldn't acknowledge you publicly." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. He sank into his chair, suddenly looking far older than his 64 years. "He was alive. All those years I grew up believing I was an orphan, rescued by generous relatives. He was there, watching me, knowing exactly who I was and where I came from. According to these papers, he died in 1987, Emma continued. But by then, you were already established as his legitimate heir. The secret died with him, or so they thought, Alexander said, his voice hardening with determination. But secrets have a way of surviving, don't they? Especially when they're carried in something as innocent as a music box melody. Their reunion was interrupted by the soft chime of Alexander's private elevator. His assistant appeared in the doorway, her professional composure marred by obvious anxiety. "Mr. Thornfield, I'm sorry to disturb you, but your cousin Richard is here. He says it's urgent family business and insists on seeing you immediately." Alexander and Emma exchanged a look of alarm. If word of their discovery had already reached other family members, it could only mean that someone had been watching, waiting for exactly this kind of threat to emerge. "Send him in, Helen," Alexander said, his voice carefully controlled. "And please hold all my calls." Richard Thornfield entered the office with the predatory confidence of a man who had spent his entire life believing that money and connections could solve any problem. He was younger than Alexander by perhaps 10 years, with the kind of aggressive charm that had made him successful in pharmaceutical sales and family politics. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his smile practiced and dangerous. "Alex," he said, his gaze immediately fixing on Emma with calculating interest. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything too important." He gestured dismissively at the letters spread across the desk. "Helen mentioned you were meeting with one of the Harbor Club staff about some family memorabilia. How interesting." "Richard," Alexander replied carefully, "this is Miss Harper. We were discussing some historical documents related to the family's early years." "Historical documents?" Richard's laugh was sharp and cold. "How wonderfully academic. You know, it's fascinating how these old family stories have a way of surfacing just when someone finds themselves facing financial pressures. Assisted living care is so expensive these days, isn't it, Miss Harper?" The casual cruelty of the comment, the way he had obviously investigated Emma's personal situation, made her cheeks burn with anger. "This isn't about money." "Oh, but it always is with people like you," Richard said, settling into one of Alexander's leather chairs as if he owned the office. "Poor relatives appearing out of nowhere with touching stories about long-lost connections, hoping the family will open their checkbook to make the inconvenience go away." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a tone that was somehow more menacing than any shout. "But here's what you don't understand about the Thornfield family, Miss Harper. We didn't build this pharmaceutical empire by being sentimental about every sob story that walks through our doors. We've survived and thrived by being smarter and more ruthless than people who think emotional manipulation can substitute for legal standing." Alexander stood abruptly, his controlled facade cracking under the weight of what he was hearing. "That's enough, Richard. You have no idea what Miss Harper has brought to light." "Don't I?" Richard's smile turned genuinely predatory. "Isabella Santos, the Portuguese housemaid who tried to extort money from the family in 1959. Edmund Jr. handled that situation very efficiently, just like we've handled every other threat to the family's reputation over the years." The casual admission that the family had known about Isabella all along hung in the air like poison. Emma felt her world tilting as she realized they were dealing with a conspiracy that had lasted for over 6 decades. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew she was alive, and you let Alexander believe she was dead." "We protected Alexander from an inconvenient truth that would have served no one's interests," Richard replied smoothly. "Isabella Santos was paid handsomely for her silence, and she honored that agreement until her death. She understood that some secrets are worth more than the temporary satisfaction of emotional reunions." But Alexander wasn't backing down. "There's one crucial detail you've overlooked, Richard. Miss Harper isn't here to ask for money. She's here to claim what's rightfully hers under Massachusetts inheritance law." Richard's confident expression faltered for the first time. "What are you talking about?" Isabella never signed away her rights to her son's inheritance, Alexander said, his lawyer's instincts taking over. The adoption papers were fraudulent. They claimed she was an unwed mother, when in fact she was the legal wife of Edmund Thornfield, Jr., married in a civil ceremony in Providence 3 months before I was born. Emma stared at Alexander in shock. Married? But the birth certificate listed her as unmarried because acknowledging the marriage would have meant acknowledging that Edmund Jr. was a bigamist, Alexander explained. He was already married to Helen Worthington when he fell in love with Isabella. Rather than divorce his society wife and face scandal, he chose to hide his second family entirely. The implications were staggering. If Isabella had been legally married to Edmund Jr., then Alexander wasn't an adopted orphan. He was the legitimate heir to the Thornfield fortune, and Emma, as Isabella's descendant, had a claim to the family inheritance that no amount of money or legal maneuvering could erase. Richard's mask of civility dissolved completely. "You're talking about destroying everything our family has built over 3 generations, he hissed. "You're willing to tear down a pharmaceutical company that employs thousands of people, that develops life-saving medications, all for some romantic notion about honoring the memory of a dead cleaning woman?" "I'm talking about honoring the memory of my mother," Alexander said quietly. "The mother whose love was stolen from me by people who valued reputation more than human dignity." Before Richard could respond, Alexander picked up his phone. "Security? This is Alexander Thornfield. I need you to escort Mr. Richard Thornfield from the building immediately. He's no longer welcome on company property." "You can't do this," Richard snarled, as security guards appeared in the doorway. "The board will never support you. The family will fight this in court for decades." "Let them try," Alexander replied. "But they'll be fighting against the truth. And the truth has a way of winning in the end." As Richard was escorted from the building, still shouting threats about family loyalty and corporate responsibility, Emma realized that their quest for justice was just beginning. But for the first time since discovering the music box's secret, she felt hope that Isabella's love might finally triumph over the forces that had tried to destroy it. The legal battle that followed dominated Boston's headlines for over a year. The discovery of Isabella's marriage certificate, hidden in the archives of Providence City Hall, proved that Alexander was indeed the legitimate son of Edmund Thornfield, Jr. Forensic handwriting experts confirmed that Isabella had been coerced into signing falsified adoption papers, making the entire legal foundation of Alexander's childhood a fraud. Richard Thornfield and several other family members were ultimately charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruction of justice. The civil courts ruled that Isabella's descendants were entitled to a significant portion of the Thornfield family trust, plus damages for 6 decades of stolen inheritance. But perhaps the most meaningful resolution came on a crisp autumn morning at Mount Auburn Cemetery, where Isabella Santos had been buried in an unmarked grave in the charity section. Alexander had arranged for a proper headstone. Its inscription, written in both English and Portuguese, "Isabella Marie Santos Thornfield, beloved mother and wife, 1940-2023. Love never dies. It only waits to be remembered." Emma stood beside Alexander as they placed white roses on the grave. The music box opened between them, its melody carrying across the cemetery like a lullaby finally reaching its intended audience. Her mother Patricia was there too, in her wheelchair, but smiling for the first time in months, surrounded by family members she had never known existed. "She would have been so proud of what we accomplished," Emma said, winding the music box one more time. "She kept your father's love alive for over 60 years, waiting for someone to discover the truth." Alexander nodded, his own flowers, yellow roses symbolizing remembrance, joining hers on the grave. The Thornfield family built its fortune on the silence of people like Isabella. It's time we use that fortune to honor their memory instead of hiding from it, The Isabella Santos Foundation was established 6 months later, dedicated to providing support for single mothers facing pressure to give up their children for adoption. Alexander stepped down as CEO of Thornfield Industries to run the foundation full-time, while Emma completed her business degree and joined him as program director. The music box that had started it all was displayed in the foundation's offices, alongside photographs of Isabella at different stages of her life, as a young woman in love, as a heartbroken mother signing away her rights, and as an elderly grandmother who never stopped believing that love could conquer even the most determined efforts to destroy it. Sometimes the most powerful truths are carried in the simplest melodies. Isabella's music box had played the same waltz for over 60 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal the secret it had been protecting. When that moment finally came, its message was clear. Love transcends death, truth conquers deception, and family bonds can survive even the most systematic attempts to sever them. The Thornfield dynasty learned that some secrets refuse to stay buried, especially when they're preserved in a grandmother's devotion and carried forward by those who understand that the most valuable inheritance isn't money. It's the truth about who we are and where we come from. What would you have done if you discovered that your entire family history was built on lies designed to separate you from your birth mother? Would you have had the courage to challenge a powerful family's version of the truth, knowing that previous efforts to expose them had been systematically suppressed? If this story of maternal love transcending death, hidden truth finally emerging, and justice being served against impossible odds moved you, please like and share this video with someone who believes that the strongest family bonds are forged not by blood alone, but by love that refuses to be forgotten. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people discovering extraordinary courage when faced with powerful forces trying to bury their truth. Hit that notification bell to never miss our latest uploads, featuring real-life dramas that prove the most precious melodies are often the ones that take a lifetime to be heard.